Hello. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adriana Vidal. I am the chair of the Global Partnership on Forest and Landscape Restoration. And I also work in IUCN in the climate change team as Senior Forest Policy Officer. I am truly happy to be here with all of you for this session, which I will be moderating. We heard in yesterday's plenary a call for all of us. We need to transform agri-food and production systems to be more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable by creating and replicating win-win solutions for feeding the world and stop losing forests. This transformation can occur if we transition to a green and a restoration economy. The benefits of restoring ecosystems have been estimated in terms of jobs, carbon sequestration, resilience, and many other benefits. This is a reality as well. For instance, the restoration of 4 million hectares of degraded land in the Sahara and the Sahel with the Great Green Wall Initiative has already created more than 300,000 jobs. We have tools, knowledge, and science telling us that there is a potential to restore over 2 billion hectares of the world's deforested and degraded landscapes, an area larger than South America. So this session is going to inspire you, is going to show you the many ways that across the world countries are scaling up restoration. We're going to learn from ongoing successful restoration initiatives, forest and landscape restoration particularly, that bring the implementation of the Bond Challenge and the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration to the front. Country representatives will show you different perspectives on various restoration practices and governance schemes in multiple contexts and ecosystems. So our first panel is going to consist of country representatives, while the second panel will have leaders and experts that will tell us more about the different streams of work to support more and more restoration on the ground. With that, let me introduce you to our keynote speaker. Tina Vahanen, the Deputy Director of FAO's Forestry Division. She's going to share with us some keynotes before the start of the session. Please, Tina.
Thank you so much, Adriana, and thank you for having me here. So I work in FAO, as Adriana was mentioning, and instead of perhaps a traditional keynote speech, I'm going to just present you a PowerPoint. And that PowerPoint is an update of what is going on in the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So I imagine that most of you actually are familiar with this story and are already participating one way or another in the UN Decade activities. But let me just give a little bit of background. So basically, the objective, obviously, the UN Decade is to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide. So in March 2019, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution for establishing the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And that resolution also invited, and in fact requested, FAO and UN Environment Programme, UNEP, to co-lead this decade. And in September 2020, the UN Decade strategy and visual identity were released. So the first year has gone. We are now in the second year of the decade, and quite a number of things have happened since. So I will just brief you what we have done. But first, there's really quite a number of barriers to achieve the UN Decade vision. And let me just read out the vision. I normally don't read any of my speaking points, but I do read this paragraph because it's a quite powerful statement. So what is the vision of the, to achieve the UN Decade, vision of the UN Decade on ecosystem restoration? So the UN Decade is a world where, for the health and well-being of all life on Earth and that of future generations, the relationship between humans and nature has been restored, where the area of healthy ecosystems is increasing, and where ecosystem loss, fragmentation, and degradation has been ended. Can we do all this in the next 8 years? Because the UN Decade actually lasts until the 2030. But it is a powerful vision, and we hope we will be able to achieve this vision. But there are a number of barriers to this vision and to achieve the goals of the UN Decade. The UN Decade strategy identifies 7 barriers. There are probably many others, but we have lumped them in the 7 main categories. First, lack of political will still, even though obviously the countries have pledged a lot of areas, a lot of hectares for restoration, but still in the end of the day, there is a will to do something and announce those commitments, but there is still a lack of political will to actually move those commitments in the action, because the political will and guidance is needed for that. Public awareness is still pretty low. Here we are totally talking perhaps to each other, that every one of us works one way or another, at least in forests, forest-related issues, but also perhaps also in restoration. So we obviously do know, and we are professionals, most of us, but the public awareness of why restoration is important is still lacking. In addition, the legislative and policy environments are pretty weak for encouraging restoration and making it happen, having a good governance systems, institutions in place. In many developing countries, this is still not in place. Scientific research, it is a barrier in terms that maybe the technologies are not yet enough advanced, and also in terms of that technologies and science should include more the traditional knowledge. So combining the traditional knowledge with the modern science is something that is quite of a challenge still. Finance, clearly an issue that is lacking in many areas, many issues, many actions on forests. I mean, imagine the agricultural subsidies that have been discussed already yesterday and even earlier today. Agricultural subsidies currently amount to 540 billion US dollars. Imagine even a fraction of that would be available for restoration. We would go very, very far, but that's not happening yet. But hopefully within this decade, we can actually repurpose some of those subsidies that are harmful for the environment. We could perhaps repurpose them and also use them for restoration. And then, last but not least, the technical capacity in many countries is still quite low. But this is a big task because we really do want to move the action on the ground, not only talk, not only have commitments, but really work on the ground. So in the UN Decade, we are developing a proper action plan. The initial draft of this action plan has gone already through a consultation with our partner network the end of last year. And the draft action plan will go for a public consultation relatively soon. And the final action plan is, we hopefully will be able to finalize that by July 2022. So, since this is the United Nations decade, we have had to formalize that to some extent. So we have a governance for the UN decade, for being able to implement the UN decade. We have a strategy group that is basically senior managers from FAO and from UNEP. So that forms the kind of a group that oversees the implementation of the UN decade. But then we have created 5 task forces on best practices, on monitoring, on science, on financing, and on youth. And these task forces are actually the machinery through which we work to make sure that we can overcome those barriers and provide knowledge to overcome those barriers. Then we have a very wide network of partners. Way over 100 different organizations are partners to the UNDK, and that number is growing. And these partners are mostly the partners that are helping to implement actions in the countries or regions. They can be NGOs, other UN agencies, scientific institutions, and so forth. But the partner network is very, very wide. And likewise, there is an advisory board to the UN Decade. Likewise, it's a multi-stakeholder advisory board that is advising on the sort of how the implementation of the decade will be in a proper track, and also monitoring the progress. Okay, where we are on restoration, in fact. So countries have already pledged to restore more than 1 billion hectares. That's an area larger than China. And they have done that as part of their commitments to Sustainable Development Goals and Rio Conventions. We often hear, and even here we have heard the 350 million hectares to be achieved by 2030. So that's the Bonn Challenge target. But here we're talking about 1 billion hectares that have already been pledged by governments. Indeed, an area that is larger than China. But, as I mentioned, one of the barriers is the lack of knowledge. So very little is known about the quality of restoration and progress towards these goals that countries themselves have established. And also the restoration success stories and lessons learned are not really distributed and shared widely enough. And that really leads to the fact that there is no enough action on the ground. And what we use in this UN Decade as kind of a core vehicle to implement activities and actions are actually what we call restoration flagships, the world restoration flagships. They should be the first, best, or most promising examples of large-scale and long-term ecosystem restoration that embody the 10 principles for ecosystem restorations that we have developed, and they should inspire others to undertake or accelerate restoration at significant scale. We actually have a call for these world restoration flagships. The first call ended at the end of March. This call was targeted to governments, but we will open this call later on, first of all, to include more governments and countries to join, but also or submit the proposals for the flagships, but also other stakeholders. And the first 10 selected flagships will be announced and celebrated at the next United Nations General Assembly in next September. We have also established a multi-partner trust fund for coordinating and providing catalytic funding to implement the UN Decade activities. This fund currently, the fund target is $100 million, which is a very, very small fraction of what is needed for restoration. But as I mentioned, it's to be able to provide this sort of a machinery that I was describing, this governance of the UN Decade, but also provide some catalytic funding through flagships that will be selected to be funded through this multi-partner trust fund. We have currently selected already 3 flagships, and there will be more that the board, the executive board of this trust fund has decided, and will select it even more. So they are the Great Green Wall, and then a dry corridor in Central America, and then the small island development states. That includes also then restoration activities beyond forests and land, including seascapes. The outcomes of this multi-partner trust fund are, first of all, the global movement of the ecosystem restoration that includes advocacy, knowledge management, knowledge sharing, and advertising, promoting the restoration and creating more the awareness of restoration and its importance. Then the outcome 2 of the multi-partner trust fund is to catalyze investments that would result in restoration actions on the ground and implementation within the flagship initiatives. So really catalytic funds to hopefully create more and create attractiveness to actually increase the funding from other sources, because this UN Decade multi-partner trust fund is not very big trust fund. And then outcome 3 finally is the monitoring and reporting on progress in restoration, both on the biophysical side of how much trees have been, not only trees, but forest trees is increased, or agricultural land, or seascapes that are under sustainable management. So how we have been able to restore those. So it's a biophysical aspect of restoration. And this is actually more complicated than you may think. There are side events actually during this week to describe more what we are doing more in detail on this monitoring. And then the socio-economic elements as well are included. And we are reporting to the United Nations Secretary General after the first 5 years, so we need to be able to show what we have done and are we progressing, and hopefully we are progressing. This first executive board meeting of the multi-partner trust fund was held at the end of last year, and it approved the first 5-year program from 2021 to 2025. And as I mentioned already, basically we work, at least initially, through these 3 flagship initiatives that you see in writing here. And here, if you haven't done this already, join the restoration movement. So join #GenerationRestoration. Use that in all your social media, in your communication, and join the movement. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina. Now we move to the first panel. Many of these countries are actually what Tina was mentioning, the initiatives that are going to underpin the progress under the decade. So please, I'll invite the panelists to come to the podium. Mr. Jair Urriola, Dr. Enu Sik Park, Mr. Alfred Gichu. Thank you. I'm going to just introduce them with their positions and where their countries they represent, so you have those in mind. So Mr. Jair Urriola, he's the Executive Secretary for the Central American Commission on Environment and Development within the Central American Integration System. Dr. Eun Sik Park, he's the Director General of the International Affairs Bureau of the Korea Forest Service and Secretary General of the 15th World Forestry Congress. Mr. Alfred Gichu, he's the Head of Forest Conservation at the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Kenya, on behalf of Mr. Chris Kipto, Principal Secretary of the Ministry of Environment and Forestry in Kenya. Then we'll have two representatives joining with a video. First, Ms. Eve Vasaiba Masudi, Vice Prime Minister and Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development in Democratic Republic of Congo. And the second video will come from Mrs. Arlette Sudan Nonault, Minister of Environment, Sustainable Development from Congo. Then we have Mrs. Deborah Su, Executive Director at the Ministry of Forests in Fiji. And finally, we have Mr. Chadi Mohana, Director in charge of forests in Lebanon. He's also the former chair of Silva Mediterranea. All right, so we have a packed but very, very interesting panel. So let me start straight ahead with our first question for el señor Jair Urriola. And for the ones who don't speak Spanish, please, you can use the interpretation headsets in the room. Señor Urriola, bienvenido al evento. Sabemos que recientemente la CCAD adoptó una resolución o una declaración ministerial en apoyo.
CCAD at the Council of Ministers adopted this declaration, and we will be looking into the direction of this declaration. And more importantly, there are 8 countries belonging to CCAD of Central America. Through CCAD, about 100 billion hectares of areas are being restored to achieve the net zero goal. Let us hear about what the declaration is about. Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Joining us in person and also online around the world. Thank you for joining us. First of all, on behalf of CCAD, I would like to extend my gratitude. As well introduced, CCAD consists of 8 Central American nations. And I would also like to thank you for the opportunity to officially introduce CCAT to you here today about the declaration adopted at the Council of Ministers. In the context of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, we adopted this declaration in March. At the Central American level, the fact that this declaration was adopted is very important, and El Salvador also participated. And in 2019, the 8 countries came together, and at the UN General Assembly, this declaration was presented. Central America and the Dominican Republic came together for this declaration, and the members came to an agreement that restoration is a choice for a development. After the declaration was adopted, in restoring the ecosystem, we have been implementing our work with great sense of responsibility, and we are making sure that our efforts come to fruition. 1 month ago, at the first Sustainable Landscape Congress, we were able to gather input, and regarding the importance of forests, Dominican Republic and Central American ministers of environment were able to reach agreement on the local declaration. I would like to give you an overview of the declaration, and if you can scan the QR code you see on the screen, you will be able to read the full text of the declaration. Central American forests and Dominican Republic forests are included in this declaration, which states that forests are a very important priority for us. And placing such priority on forests are still under discussion. And we will restore forests in Central America in line with the UN Decade on the Restoration of Ecosystems. Thereby, we will eradicate poverty and form a resilient community, adapt to the climate change, and prevent an mass extinction of species. At the local region, we will make efforts for restoration. We will also faithfully implement our regulations and help forest restoration and sustainable use of resources. Indigenous people and the American residents will be able to use the forest in a healthy manner. They live in the forest and they use the forest. Our political will in forestry will proceed under AFOLO 2040. Along with forest restoration, a more sustainable production will be further supported through multifaceted efforts. Not only the UNEP, but CCAT will work together. And we will continue on to reinforce not only the forestry sector, but tourism, energy, health, education, and other sectors comprehensively so that we can pursue a more sustainable development. In addition, and in particular, our efforts will focus on restoring biodiversity. And by well managing protected areas, we will more clearly increase the ecological connection. We will also provide greater support to poor and vulnerable regions. And in doing so, we will also reinforce the security for our people. Furthermore, support for public and private sectors of each of our nations will be further strengthened by reinforcing local initiatives and international cooperations. Restoration, sustainable forestry, conservation, and all other efforts will continue on. Our member states are well aware of all the importance, and we have great examples. In implementing our efforts, we have had great success. And moving on to international contribution, all national, international commitments will be was carried out with great efforts for protection, conservation, and restoration. As I have mentioned, at the CCAD level in April, in order to improve landscapes, we have made other efforts. And again, if you can scan this QR code, you can look through the text, and I'd like to take your questions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor Urriola. Now we're going to move.
Thank you very much.
To hear from Dr. Park, about the vision and goals of Korea. We know that you are working very hard on investments and support internationally on landscape restoration, as well as in-country action. So we would like to hear more about what are the vision and goals for this cooperation at the international level as well as action at the national level. Thank you.
예, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. As was introduced, I am Eun-sik Park, and I'm Director General of the International Affairs Bureau of the Korea Forest Service. And I am also the Secretary General of this very Congress. So I would like to welcome you all, and thank you very much for your participation. The UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration is an important goal for the international community. Now, I would like to nevertheless talk about the Korean example. If you look at the ecosystem restoration endeavors in Korea, they have actually been completed. So of course, there is this goal of enhancing the quality of ecosystem in Korea, but the forest restoration effort has been completed here in Korea. So I would like to talk about two things. First is about the past. In the past, we also suffered from serious degradation of the forest. So I would like to talk about our past efforts in Korea to overcome that. And then I would also like to talk about what we are doing internationally in partnership with other stakeholders to restore ecosystems. In the 1960s and 1970s, now this was after the Korean War and the colonial rule by Japan, and after those periods there was significant degradation. The state of the Korean forests were very degraded. At the time, many UN representatives visited Korea, and they saw that it was in a state of severe degradation, and the forest in Korea was in a very terrible state. And in the early 1980s, once again, UN representatives visited Korea, and then they re-evaluated the status of Korean forest. And they said Korea is the only country since World War II have successfully restored its forests. And this was the assessment that was made by international representatives from UN, and I think this is perhaps one of the reasons why we were able to become the host of World Forestry Congress this year. So how was it possible for us to succeed in such restoration? I think one factor was that all Koreans participated in the effort. And it's just not my personal evaluation, but scientists and other researchers attest to this. The local communities formed forest restoration groups, and they would plant trees and managed the forests. And the Korean government also saw restoration of the forest as an important political agenda. And the president, as well as ministers, continuously try to monitor and follow up on the achievements. In 1967, Korea Forestry Service was established, becoming the leading organization in Korea to manage this effort to restore forests. And also there was a law that would prohibit the slash and burn type of agriculture in Korea. And then in 1973, Korea established a basic national plan to plant a target number of trees and would monitor the progress. Thankfully, we were able to achieve the targets 2 years faster than originally planned. And so we followed up with a second plan, and that also was completed successfully. And then we also engaged in protection policies. At the time, Korea's income level was relatively low. So there was a lot of illegal logging done in secret. So there were polices trying to crack down on such illegal practices. And also the pest control programs were instituted. And also in the case of wildfire, we acted quickly to address those fires and prevent wildfires from occurring again. When we were instituting these pest controls, there were not enough supplies. So oftentimes the local residents would actually, walk into the mountains trying to, catch pests. And there was this campaign to plant trees. And there was this month where all Koreans got involved in planting of trees. And with such efforts, in 1987, the Korean government announced that our reforestation efforts had been completed with success. And again, the success factors include the fact that all Koreans got involved and that this reforestation efforts were given top priority in the political agenda. And also there were the Korea Forestry Service and other government agencies taking steps to implement the plans to success. And as Tina mentioned, how to engage people in the UN decade, I think there are two challenges. First, we need to designate protected area in order to help ecosystems regain their functions. And we are doing just that here in Korea. And secondly, we are trying to participate in international efforts. So we work with international agencies and we work with developing countries in various programs and projects. And we are involved in the UNCCD, and there's Changwon Initiative, and also Peaceful Forest Initiative in which we participate. And also we are involved in FMRM. And in Mongolia, we are working to support their restoration of forests. Already, 3,000 hectares or more of forests have been restored in Mongolia as a result. And recently, we are working to support 3 Central American countries to restore their forests. And I think perhaps we could also apply for the flagship program with this endeavor. And we are also going to work with the UNEP to do what's called SAFE, which is the name of the project for conserving biodiversity. And we would like to launch this SAFE initiative with UNEP. And we will continue to engage with the international community for UN Decade goals.
Thank you very much, Dr. Park. It's a very quick but thorough details of how South Korea achieved their goals. It's very inspiring indeed. Now, moving to Africa, our first speaker of the region is Mr. Alfred Gichu from Kenya. Mr. Gichu, in 2016, Kenya made a voluntary pledge to restore 5 million hectares under the Bond Challenge and AFR 100, which is 9% of your territory. We would like to learn from the different actions that have taken place so far to achieve this pledge and what under restoration looks like in Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks to FAO for giving us an opportunity for this knowledge sharing session, and to Korea Forest Service for an excellent hosting of this event. Before I respond to your question directly, allow me to share some background information about my country. Yes, it's true, we made a commitment of 5.1 million hectare restoration. But this information, this background information is extremely important. We are coming from a country, Kenya, that is a low forest cover country. And 80% of Kenya is arid and semi-arid. But that notwithstanding, Kenya has made commitment to restore our landscapes in support of our global restoration goals, our climate, our biodiversity, desertification, our control. We are also parties to the Glasgow Leaders Commitment. But we are also coming from a country where the government, the population, and the private sector especially are impatient for results. Yes, we did. We made our commitment in 2016, but between that then and now is a situation we find ourselves where the government wants to see results. Realizing that we made our commitments for delivery by 2030, and then we do not have then, as we sit here, the luxury of time, but we still see within a country a lot of opportunities for land restoration in support of the goals that I've just talked about. And the opportunities present in terms of restoration of landscapes, they present in terms of reducing deforestation from the forest that we are already managing, and they present in terms of reducing degradation in the landscapes too. But that said, who owns the land in Kenya? Because it's about tenure. If the government owns this land, it would be very easy for us to invest in restoration programs driven by the government. But we have in Kenya a situation where land is owned, yes, partly by the government. The communities own the land, and part of that land is also in private hands. So the discussion then we have been having is one where we needed to go into a strong partnership and collaboration amongst Kenyans, so that we move as a team towards delivery of these national goals. So we came together after 2016 through a process that was led by the government, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And what we did was to come up with a national strategy for restoration. And we are calling that strategy the National Strategy for Accelerated Achievement and Maintenance of over 10% forest cover. And as I've said, it's a framework. That strategy to us is a framework for strengthened partnership and collaboration, but we are also moving it forward as a shared responsibility, recognizing that the government does not have adequate resources to finance restoration programs across the country, on private land, on community land, even on public lands. The government does not have enough financing. So we are sharing it. We are sharing the strategy for the private sector to come in with its own resources to support a national restoration effort. The 2016 a number that we shared as part of Kenya's commitment also identified a number of opportunities, restoration options that the government could go into to support its realization. Some of those actions are in public lands that are managed by government agencies. And we are proposing, as part of that national strategy, actions that seek to strengthen governance, actions that seek to support a restoration of degraded areas within those public forests. And even in those public forests, because the law requires that we manage those forests through a consultation process, we are also encouraging other stakeholders, NGOs, the private sector, to come in and partner. How they are partnering is also sometimes quite innovative, because we are encouraging them to come and manage certain blocks of public forests for delivery of mainly environmental services, climate, water, biodiversity, and then the Kenya Forest Service, or the government for that matter, then retains some regulatory responsibility to ensure that those services are delivered in the course of time. We are also investing, as part of that program, as support to massive seedling production. Again, with knowledge that for us to achieve 5.1 million hectares commitment, we need to invest in new afforestation and reforestation programs. So we are promoting a massive seedling production for use by stakeholders across the board for restoration of landscapes. Those public forests that are degraded, we are providing opportunities for their restoration within the agricultural land, because we are implementing this national strategy as a landscape program. So there are activities that we are doing in forests, we have activities we are proposing in agricultural land, and we have activities we are proposing even in the rangelands. In the agricultural lands, they are private in nature. What we are promoting is strong investment in agroforestry, a strong investment where opportunities manifest in commercial forestry. And even in agroforestry, we are talking to the farmers so that they can invest in tree-based interventions that deliver livelihood benefits. You don't have to grow a tree just for the sake of it. We are encouraging them where opportunities are available for them to do fruit tree growing, to invest in that. In the regions, we seek to strengthen the way we manage our livestock management systems that support environmental and forest conservation benefits. We are promoting greening of infrastructure. We are promoting greening of institutions in the country, and we are promoting also a greening of our urban areas. But more importantly is that we also want to strengthen governance of forestry, realizing that there are governance issues that have traditionally manifested within that country that have informed the current state of affairs. We have the national government, we have the county governments, we have the private sector. The last but not least is that we need to mobilize financing. And how are we mobilizing financing? We are drawing support from public and private financing sources. And we have developed, as part of our national strategy, a tree growing financing strategy that will support our efforts moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gitu. You've pointed out key conditions, key enabling conditions for the scaling up of ecosystem restoration. So with that in mind, I would like to ask the facilitators team to please play the videos coming from Democratic Republic of Congo and Republic of Congo to complement these visions.
Et l'agriculture, FAO en sigle. Mesdames et messieurs les ministres et chers collègues, mesdames et messieurs les membres des délégations, à vos titres et qualités respectifs. La République démocratique du Congo, mon pays, se réjouit d'avoir été invité à cette importante session relative aux programmes mondiaux de la restauration de la décennie des Nations Unies pour la restauration des écosystèmes. Je remercie les organisateurs du congrès dont le thème central « Construire un avenir vert, sain et résilient avec les forêts » concorde très bien avec les priorités de mon pays en matière de gestion durable des écosystèmes forestiers. La République démocratique du
So the Democratic Republic of Korea has a land size of 2.345 million square kilometers, and of that, forest area accounts for 67%. And the forest areas account for 10% of world's tropical forest and 60% of Congo Basin's forest area. And in order to decrease the deforestation rate to less than 0.2%, we are working to remove the causes of degradation of forest landscape. And forest governance is an important political agenda for the government. And we participate in COMIFAC, which is the Commission of Central African Forests. And DR Congo and COMIFAC's plan include the following. We respect human rights, and we respect the rights of the indigenous people, and we respect the independence of the rural women, and we also respect the youth and entrepreneurship, and we have taken into account the SDGs in our planning. Forests contribute greatly to economic development, and especially they can help achieve increase in employment. And DR Congo's forests can help mitigate climate change. Each day, 24.5 gigatons of greenhouse gases can be stored by Congo's forests, and 3/4 account for 43% of the land area. And the peat layer in the forest can be an effective storage for carbon. And the amount of carbon storage that can be done by this peat layer is equivalent to 2 years' worth of emissions. And DR Congo has an ecosystem that also impact the rainfall for Eritrea and South Sudan and other adjacent regions. And we are working on the African Initiative for Resilient Landscape. And Agenda 2060 is something that we co-work on with partner countries. And we want to restore 8 million hectares of forests under this initiative. The DR Congo government has regained control of some 3.34 million hectares, which is 33,430 square kilometers. And this land had been illegally deforested in the past. And so I would like to take this opportunity to thank FAO and UNDP and the Central African Forest Initiative for supporting our efforts to restore our forests. DR Congo is one of the richest countries in terms of biodiversity. Numerous fauna and flora have habitat in DR Congo, and we're one of the top 5 countries in terms of biodiversity richness. But there are a lot of threats that can impact the integrity of these ecosystems because of poachers and also military conflict and illegal mining and illegal logging are some of those threat factors. And there are also the cattle raisers in Sahel region who are in a way a threat to the DR Congo's forest. So the militias and foreign nationals are degrading our ecosystem. And in the Virunga National Park, some of these people have engaged in homicides. And so we need protection in this region. And the Congo River is more than 4,000 kilometers long, and it is the second longest river following Nile in Africa. And the average flow rate is 45,000 liters. And it is very deep. In fact, it is one of the deepest rivers in the world. And Congo Basin accounts for 10% of the river water in the world and 52% of the river water in Africa. And it is an important source of water for Africa. And it is the source of Blue Nile in DR Congo. But if we come back to the climate issues, the Congo Basin region continues to decline because the demand for water grows. And we need financial support to restore this area, and we need the support of our partners. We need to restore the ecosystem, and we need to overcome this crisis. And I would like to encourage our partners to support us in this endeavor so that we can together mitigate and adapt to the climate change. We need to work together. Thank you very much.
Followed by the second video from Republic of Congo.
Monsieur le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, Excellences, Mesdames.
Respected Secretary General of the UN, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take this opportunity at the 15th World Forestry Congress. I'd like to present the achievements by the Republic of Congo. It is my honor. I would like to first start by quoting the Secretary General of the UN. In 2019, in the World Environment Day, he has declared the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration and said that humanity has for too long degraded the forest, polluted the land, and conducted livestock industries that pollute this environment. We are degrading the ecosystem that is the very basis of our life. At this rate, water, food, and the materials that we need for life itself will be in scarcity. Ladies and gentlemen, Sustainable Development Goals tell us and urge us to remind ourselves of this fact. In particular, in developing nations like ours, the primary natural resources provide the source of dependence for life. The Republic of Congo can be a leader in the fight against degradation. We have the top 10 of the forests in Africa. We have 23.5 million hectares of forest, which takes up a large share of the Congo Basin. Southeast Asia, compared to Southeast Asia or Amazon, deforestation rate is not very high, but every year about 10 million hectares are lost. Against this backdrop, the Republic of Congo has been engaging in efforts to prevent degradation of forests and landscapes, during which sustainable management has always been committed. About 54,000 square kilometers of forest is able to store about 100 billion tons of CO2, which leads to a reduction of carbon emissions and enablement of protection of the earth from warming. This is what the international community, why the international community must invest in restoration. Otherwise, this will become a ticking time bomb. Ladies and gentlemen, the sustainable management of forests in terms of political, diplomatic, economic, and environment factors is very important. From the political perspective, through SFM, we will be able to deliver on the international commitments such as the Paris Agreement. In other words, we can limit the rise of the global temperature to 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees. Our government, in order to protect and restore the forest, has been demonstrating great leadership, particularly by the president. And including such presidential commitment, political commitment is shown through REDD+ and carbon reduction programs. From the diplomatic perspective, through forest policies, regional diplomatic activities with the DRC in particular can be deployed, and more specifically, internationally and regionally, the World Peatland Restoration Initiative Congress was held, the third session, in 2003 here in Congo. Basically, the point is to use the tropical peatland, peat layer for the people, and to be an active participant of such national strategies. We can contribute internationally, and also specifically at this level, we have designated a special emissions reduction goal for the land. In various industries, carbons are emitted, and we must reduce such emissions and increase forests and support eco-friendly agricultural activities. We can also mitigate natural disaster risks by placing national priority, and climate finance or carbon pricing will also be started. There are two means to this end. One is finance. We will be able to address climate change through finance and also pursue economic development. With the African Union, we have formed the Blue Fund. And through Blue Fund, we will be able to protect the Congo Basin. The green development model will be presented to the international community through this project. And sustainable tropical forest management will also be enabled, and we will be able to address climate change as well. We must make more efforts, in particular, in terms of legal framework and regulation. UNFCCC or CBD or UNCCD or chemicals, hazardous materials convention, or other Blue Fund-based operation of tropical forests must all be revitalized. Let us protect our homes. Thank you.
I kindly ask for the next panelist to please perform or deliver your key messages within the 5 minutes, just to allow panel 2 to continue. Thank you. So now with Mrs. Deborah Su from Fiji, changing gears very much to another location in the world. Forest and landscape restoration can be very different in small island states. Can you please walk us through FLR initiatives in Fiji and in the Pacific Islands? How is FLR designed in these regions to support your priorities? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to represent Fiji, where we do restoration for ecosystem services, especially carbon, biodiversity, and water. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Fiji, because quite often we're not even on the world map. So we're directly across from North Australia, North Queensland, and directly above New Zealand. So if the international date line was straight, it would go through Fiji. We're also a volcanic island system, and we're right next to Tonga, where there was a volcanic eruption very recently. So therefore, we also have volcanic islands. But in actual fact, we have more than 300 islands that total 1 million hectares. Most of them are quite tiny, but we have a couple of big ones and about 6 good-sized volcanic ones as well. Our need for reforestation stems from the fact that all of Fiji used to be forested at one time, and we have 5 different forest types because of the wet and dry weather and altitude up to 1,324 meters. We have mangrove forests in the river estuaries and along the coastlines. Also on the windward sides of the main islands, we have lowland rainforests, upland rainforests, and cloud forests. We also have dry forests on the leeward sides, and these are very endangered. Other vegetation types also include wetlands, grasslands, beach and coastal assemblages, and island ecosystems. So even though we're quite small and very isolated, we have quite a lot of range in diversity, and we don't have much. So that makes us a little more vulnerable, being isolated and small islands. Nowadays, we have only about 2/3 of Fiji forested, and only half of that is good quality, healthy native forest ecosystems that are also quite fragmented. Reforestation commitments fell upon the Ministry of Forestry very suddenly. In 2019, 4 million trees needed to be planted over 4 years. Bearing in mind, we didn't do much reforestation before this. Also, about a year later, the figure jumped to 30 million trees over 15 years. So that was twice as many trees that we needed to plant on an annual basis. Our reforestation challenges include the fact that there isn't much appreciation for our native forests. The perception is that exotic plantation species of Caribbean pine and Honduran mahogany are the ones that bring the high monetary returns. Mass planting of native species is only now beginning, and the forestry sector is not prepared. Our native forest seeds are harvested from the wilds because we don't have orchards yet. And these trees are usually also very isolated, and one needs to be there at the right time to collect the seeds. Then it's another year to actually process the seeds, germinate them, and grow them out to a different size to be planted out. There is also much supportive governance and attitudes that need to be developed in the Ministry of Forestry with the other government agencies and also all the stakeholders, especially as about 90% of all the land in Fiji is communally owned by the indigenous Fijians, the Italke people. I have to tell you that my appearance is very deceiving because of my Asian ancestry, and I'd like to introduce to you my colleague Maika Deveta, please. So they look quite African as well, but also Polynesian. So in order to make restoration a success in Fiji, we need to work with these landowning communities, and we're starting to develop the supportive framework for this, a governance framework especially. The Ministry of Forestry works with various civil society organizations and bigger ones, such as the German International Climate Initiative, NFAO, that have respectively funded and managed a project for forest and landscape restoration for climate benefits and resilience in Fiji. The restoration processes include community and stakeholder consultation, land use planning, and planning to plant the trees in the right places at the right time, as well as for the right purpose. Alternative income generating activities are also supported, and an example of this is the beekeeping for honey, from which there are a multitude of products. We found that community work, one needs to find a champion, the one person out of the 30 in your workshop, the one that is in still wrapped participation by the end of the workshop, a week-long workshop, mind you, and the one that actually does what you hope will happen when you've gone back home. It's that one that makes a success story and becomes a leader for everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Su. Great example of the diversity of your landscapes and people. Thank you. Now moving to the last panelist of the session, Mr. Chadi Moana. In the last Silva Mediterranean meeting in March this year, countries in the region adopted the Antalya Declaration that included mention to accelerate the implementation of the Agadir Commitment, which is to bring under restoration 8 million hectares by 2030. Can you please illustrate some of the ongoing efforts in the Mediterranean region and in Lebanon? Thank you.
Thank you, Adriana. I'll try to be within the 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Even if you're asking the national and the regional aspects, but I'll do my best. Well, thank you for being here, and I would like to thank also FAO and the Korean Forestry Service for this organization and for letting us be here to speak a little bit about the Mediterranean in general and Lebanon. I will start with the national level. In fact, like 20 years ago, we started thinking a lot just after the civil war of reforestation. You know, we are very proud of our Cedrus libani, which is in the center of our flag. And so we started doing reforestation. We were obsessed by reforestation, let's say. And in 2012, we launched a program that would seem for many countries very minimal, but it's the 40 million trees, which for us is a very important number, aiming to move from 13 to 20% of forest area. And for us, it was a very big achievement launching this program, and it attracted a lot of funds, a lot of international donors, the local society, the political will was there, etc. And we started, even if we followed the multi-stakeholder approach, the bottom-up approach that we always learned in the books. But when we started implementing it, and very recently we started seeing that there was some problematics, mainly when we started having problems with our land use. the grazing areas, for example, because the agriculture area, in fact, we were trying to monopolize everything to do reforestation. And hopefully, and here I thank FAO and Korea and Germany, that the FLR mechanism came to the light. And then it was a very good opportunity for us to change our way of thinking. As I said, our main objective used to be planting trees, creating forests. Now we're thinking differently. Now we're using reforestation as a tool for restoration. But it's not the only tool. We are rehabilitating also rangelands. We are rehabilitating old agricultural terraces. They might not account for a lot of hectares, but they are very important for the society. Since the Syrian crisis and the Syrian refugees in Lebanon, with the last 2 years, very hard economic situation, crisis in Lebanon. So we are really now finding it very important and very crucial to combine the restoration with the food security issue, with the social needs issues. Even trying to go with the idea of grazing in the forests, which used to be a taboo in Lebanon, considering the goat or the sheep as the devil for the forest. So now we're thinking a bit different, and this is giving very good impacts. Also, the civil society now, the NGOs, the municipalities, are walking with us in this path. So this is what I wanted to say on the national level. At the region, yes, it's been 3 years. I was at the chairmanship of Silvamed, and we worked a lot despite the COVID situation on restoration. You mentioned, Mrs. Chair, that we launched in Agadir, the Agadir commitment to, it was 10 countries there, to rehabilitate, to restore 8 million hectares. Recently with FAO at Silvamed, we are conducting a study to see where do we stand now. The first number are very encouraging, but we still need to have a field proofing, let's say. The study that is being made is mainly counting on literature, on the project implemented in the area, but we still need the validation of the focal points. We're very optimistic in reaching these the targets. The Agadir commitment was followed by the 6th edition of the Mediterranean Forest Week. It was in Lebanon, in Brumana, where we started hearing the voice of the youth and the role of the youth in the restoration. And that was it was culminating, let's say, in Antalya, in the last Mediterranean Forest Week, where the youth were directly integrated. And one of the topics was how the restoration could create jobs for the youth in what we call the green jobs, etc. And the cherry on top of the Antalya Declaration was, as Tina was talking at the beginning, of the flagships, and we managed to sign and send a flagship in the name of the Mediterranean countries, in the name of Silvamed, and we managed to send it on time, and now we cross fingers to be selected for the next edition. And with that, I thank you. I managed to have my bike.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing the story of Lebanon and how you've made progress based on what your people feel are priorities for restoration. Unfortunately, I have to hand over the moderation of the second panel because I have to join another event that starts in a couple of minutes. It's been a pleasure being with you all in this session, and I am sure that we'll see each other in the next days. Thank you so much. Christophe, please, over to you.
Thank you, Adriana. So thank you to the panelists of the first panel for your contribution. A big applause. And I will ask to the second panel to join the table. So this is Yugrudna Srivatsava, Luc Nyakadja, Garo Batmanian, and Stéphane Allaire, please. So Jugrutna Srivatsava is the lead of the Youth Task Force. Luc Nyakaja is the lead of the Science Task Force. Mr. Garo Batmanian is the lead of the Finance Task Force. And finally, we have a representative of the private sector, the CEO of a private company named Reforest Action, if I'm not wrong, Stéphane Allaire. I think I need to start with, if I'm not wrong, with Jugrutna. And I have a question for you. How we can bring more youth into decision-making and governance process?
Is it on? Can you hear me? Well, Christophe. Okay, wonderful. Sorry, sometimes. Thank you so much, Christophe, and of course, thank you very much for having me here. It's a true honor to be speaking here alongside some of also leaders in the generation restoration movement. The question that you asked is really, really essential. First of all, how do we, bring young people into governance, and also it is really key towards, as also what we heard from the previous panel. I think the last speaker was talking about bringing the youth. I think there are, 4 key points that I would highlight. The first is that the youth engagement should be always designated, which means that youth should not be, in that sense, a competing stakeholder groups when it comes to their engagement as compared to other civil society groups or actors. One clear example of that, of course, is the youth task force or the youth engagement model in the decade itself, where youth have been given their own space and seat and the decision-making in the table. The other aspect I would highlight, the inclusion in the governance, would be the aspect of having engagement that is based upon mandate and not invitation towards young people. Now, what does that mean? It means that role of young people should be defined and concretized within the policies. If you look at the nationally determined contributions of which especially have been revised, we have seen an increasing trend where youth participation or youth focus has been guaranteed. And that is something that is, of course, good to have in policies, but that means the governance models should by design include youth as a mandated stakeholder group or as a constituency group. Some of the models like UNEA, HLPF, UN Forest Forum itself does that, but equally some of the models, including of FAO, like FAO's Council or FAO's Committee, are not open to youth. They're not open to any stakeholders in general. So there is a lot of space for improvement that lies there. I would also, give some really good examples within the restoration spaces itself, where there have been more and more inclusion of young people in whether that's national policies or the regional policies. One example, for example, is one of the Rome-based agencies, IFAD, has over $1 billion portfolio that they have invested just on young people. So that is also something, to learn from. Finally, to conclude, I would, highlight that we were talking about this even yesterday, that when you look at the barriers that have been identified for the UN decade, all of the 6 barriers that are there, 2 of them are, of course, all of them are cross-cutting on youth, but 2 of them directly relate to young people, which is on awareness and which is on understanding what the restoration itself is. And that is a space where young people have a lot of chance to be there both as beneficiaries but also as change makers. And finally, to conclude, it is imperative that youth participation is seen not just as a space where you can tick a box, but rather as a rights-based participation, because it does not make sense that we are sitting here and talking about decade or generation restoration or what happens in 30 years from now when you don't have people that are going to be most affected at the table. So that it's a rights-based case for including youth and future generations really in the work. And I believe the multi-partner trust fund of the decade should designate resources for youth to be also using those directly without influence, from external partners on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jugrutna.
As always, effective.
Now I will give the floor to Luc Nyakaja. And the question for you, Luc, is Based on what you heard in the first panel with countries, please share some reflection and action points aligned with the Science Task Force recommendations.
Well, thank you, Christophe, and good morning to you all. We have heard from ongoing initiatives from countries, and now I would like to share with you insight from the UN Decade Science Task Force regarding how we could build on past shortcomings in implementing restoration initiatives, and as well as how we could build on them to advance nationwide and worldwide momentum for restoration. Well, why I will address two things. First is, why have previous efforts failed or been only partially successful, and what needs to change? And my second point will be how to build ecosystem restoration movement. You can check more about what I will say from the think piece released by the UN Decade Science Task Force, released last year in the fall, entitled Science-Based Ecosystem Restoration from the 2020 and beyond. So why have previous restoration efforts failed or been partially successful, and what needs to change? In the think piece, you will see 6 points made. The first is the lack of attention to near-term livelihood needs. People who depend on the ecosystem, if you want to restore without also bringing forth low-hanging fruit that they could benefit from for their livelihood, you are likely not to succeed or sustain the success. Second is limited consideration of trade-off. The trade-offs are there. Ecosystem restoration is not a blueprint for everything. So we must consider what works and what might be the trade-off, and how to convert them into synergies, or at least how to ensure that the trade-offs are not borne just by some of the stakeholders. And limited or ineffective engagement with decision makers and planners. All of them must be around the table at the onset, and be also around the table for designing the outcome, the vision, and the outcome for the restoration of the landscape. Poor science underpinning. And here, let me highlight one aspect. We too often forget that ecosystem restoration is social and ecological endeavor. We often forget the social part of it, and we tend to be top-down, while we need to build on local knowledge. That is part of the knowledge we need to succeed and sustain the success. And the fifth point, is a scarcity of institutions focused on sustaining restoration effort over longer period. We know that restoration is a long-term endeavor, though it may have low-hanging fruit. So we must make sure that we have institutions that do understand that and work on that. And there's also one aspect that we must make sure that we work on. Projects that are working on improving agriculture or enhance water resources must also ensure that they consider what needs to be done for restoration and what they might take from it. We don't have much time. I could give more examples for each one of those cases. I remember going to Niger in the landscape restoration in Niger, and we were on the field. The women were working on the infrastructure for what they call their demi-lune system. I know you are familiar with that, Christophe. But no one was monitoring the water table. If you don't monitor, how are you going to ensure that it is rewarded? So now, how can we build consensus or better consensus in advancing ecosystem restoration movement? Here you will see in the think piece 5 recommendations. First, ecosystem restoration opens new opportunities for engaging, learning, and innovation, which must be seized through the development of long-term partnership. So the opportunities must be clearly considered and seized by across the landscape of stakeholders. The second recommendation is that community and landscape rights right holders and stakeholders need to be recognized and empowered as land stewards. You may have heard from our colleague from Congo that one of the key issues is who holds the land. If that person is not around the table, you may design the best of the strategy, you will still fail. The third point is effective restoration action requires fundamental shift in economic and policy institutions towards a focus on the long term and varied benefit of functioning and diverse ecosystem. We need to make sure that the shift is in place. For instance, if pruning trees will accelerate restoration and a law forbid the pruning, you are not in business yet. The fourth point is the ideal of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, meaning partnership, inclusiveness, and joint coordinated action need to be based on shared core principles, good practices, and practical approaches to monitoring and evaluation. I know that one will ring a bell to my dear friend Christophe. And the final point we have highlighted in the think piece is ecosystem restoration actions require user-friendly information sharing and inclusive engagement from the onset, creating opportunities for multiple agents of change to work together, particularly at subnational levels. So to conclude, Christophe, well, every minute we cut down more than 15 hectares of trees, primarily to make room for food and energy production, and agriculture is therefore a threat for it. So we must make sure that we monitor to what extent agricultural expansion is not made, to the detriment of forest, and monitor how it is made rather on restored ecosystem. Christophe, thank you.
Thank you very much, Luc, for these inspirational words. Now I give the floor to Mr. Garo Batmanian. So as the lead of the Science Task Force, how do you see the potential of finance, or how to unlock finance for restoration during the decade? Thank you.
Thank you, Christophe. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's on? Can you hear? Yeah. The Finance Task Force is comprised of, with several private sector. We put that's the first thing I would like to highlight, that we put a lot of people there from the private sector, from the financial side of the private sector, banks, or those that actually need financing in investment on the field, or companies that buy their supply from forests, because we want to understand why they don't invest, how or why they invest, and what are the problems, what they do. I'm just going to be very quick here to explain that it hasn't been mentioned very well today, although it's implicit on most speeches. There is an ecosystem continuum. Agroforestry is considered restoration. Some plantation is considered restoration. So not all restoration is bring back the forest or the mangroves to the point that it was before we harvested. Therefore, we don't want to have a one tool, a one size fits all. What we are looking into it is categorizing blocks of interventions: agroforestry, forest mix, forest management, recovery of land. And on these big blocks, we are trying to identify different sources of financing. If you have an agroforestry and is economically viable, you probably can get equity. If you're just doing all the way to the end of it and you're just doing, restoration to keep the areas forest and to go there, then you probably need a bond. So we are looking at equity, loans, bonds, grants, blended funding from the capital supply, and we are trying to cross this with different types of different levels of ecosystem restoration recognized by the UN Decade. So we're trying to have a menu. The second block that we are looking is risk management. There is some investment that needs to be done for risk management, and that could be subsidy reform, which is government, or corporate offsetting that, corporations sometimes have this biodiversity offsetting opportunities. So maybe we can get it to be done in the right place where you're also restoring land. So it could be private, it could be government. We can look at insurance. A lot of companies now are looking at insurance and guarantees. And finally, we are looking a lot on green commodities. We heard this in other talks today. If governments can start having green supplies, demand for green sources of fund, of supplies, etc., that will put, or even give subsidies to it, that will put a lot of impetus for the market to grow. So in short, we're looking at different types of capital supply, different types of sources of risk management, and we are crossing them with different major blocks in the continuum of ecosystem restoration. So what we expect to have by the end of our task force is sort of a menu and recommendation that you can see, depending on the type of intervention you want to do, which ones you're going to take. A final point that I would like to make is that we're also looking, and this will be the second and final phase, is a bit of a governance issue. One thing that we heard very clearly from the private sector is that sometimes they don't make an investment because they don't have a level playing field. They say, I cannot invest in forest management if 80% of the timbers are coming from deforestation. I cannot compete. And therefore, they don't invest on forest management just because it's not that it's not economically viable. It's not economically viable on that context when they are competing with timber coming free from deforestation without taxes or subsidies or whatever. So we're also looking on the governance issue from the private sector point of view. What are the governance and other major policy roadblocks they see that prevents them to making more investment even when they want to make those investments? And that will be part of the task force as well, because you cannot look at the money without looking at the context of where the money is being put. I stop it here and make it clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very clear. The last panelist, Stefan Haller, I have a question for you. What does it entail to develop a circular economy that promotes restoration? What are the incentives to bring more entrepreneurs to this space?
Yeah, thank you, Christophe. So I'm Stefan Haller. I'm the founder and CEO of Reforest Action. Reforest Action is a private company aiming at restoring forests and but also mangroves and different type of forest-related ecosystems. We are a private company, and we fund and provide technical support and to forests, and the fundings come from private companies as well. It's only private finance. And we've been doing this for the last 12 years, and we started very little, and today, although we are only 70 people, big company, we've been running 1,000 projects in 42 countries. And what we see today is that there is two major trends that appear from the private sector. The private sector can contribute to forest restoration in two ways. The first one is carbon finance. Companies want to be carbon neutral, and therefore they wish to contribute to forest restoration. And although we are a small company, we are today creating a 200 million euros fund for forest restoration. It's the first fund. And I'm pretty sure that in a year from now, we can aim for 1 billion. And we are only Reforest Action, and we are not the only one. So the first message is, yes, I strongly believe that the private sector is now ready to fund forest restoration through the carbon finance. My job is to make sure that this money serves biodiversity on top of carbon, but also social impact and bioeconomy. Because for us to last, we all know that they need to provide sustainable income to the local population. And the second aspect where the private sector can contribute to forest restoration is by transforming their supply chain into a sustainable value chain. And we work with more and more companies, and this is quite new actually. We work with more and more companies to make their supply chain into regenerative landscapes that deliver sustainable value, and that go through circular bioeconomy. And we work with Hennessy, for instance, in France, where we improve biodiversity within their vineyards to generate still income, but also improve biodiversity. We work in India with fashion industry to create cashmere value chains, cotton and silk, while restoring landscapes. We work in different countries along creating value chains. So I believe that today the private sector is ready. What I lack now is projects. If you have project forest to restore, please go to the booth G13. We may have a solution for you. And my goal today, Christophe, is to create a generation of ecopreneurs or reforestation entrepreneurs that will create or restore land while creating sustainable value chains. I call that a generation of reforestation entrepreneurs. The UN Decade called that the ecopreneurs generation restoration. I think this is the hashtag, right? I think we're talking all about the same thing. The private sector is here. There is huge money available. The issue is how to address the project using this money. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we are very late, and I am sure that a lot of people in the room have to jump in other events, I will just briefly conclude the session. Thank you to all of you for the inspiring messages. We need now to connect the finance, the practitioners, the entrepreneurs, to achieve the vision of the decade. We are on this table. We have the science, we have the youth, we have the private, and we have the finance task force and the World Bank. I think that we are on the good way to achieve the vision of the UN Decade Strategy. Thank you, everyone. I have a small gift from the Korean Forest Service for the panelists. Some of them left, so I will give the one for DRC to you, Floribert, if you are okay to give it to your General Secretary. And maybe Sangik, can you help me to give the gift of KFS to the panelists?
Look, you made good points, especially about indigenous knowledge. So yeah, it's good to see that. I mean,
we have been nailing it.
Yeah.
For you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.